Iraqi army says that hundreds of its soldiers were slaughtered by advancing ISIL militants in Mosul as the fight for north and western Iraq rages on. The US Secretary of State makes a surprise visit to Baghdad amid the deteriorating security situation in Iraq. And Human Rights Watch reveals the use of child soldiers by ISIL militants in Syria, a practice which may constitute war crimes. Hello there, you're watching Al-Ittijah World News and I'm Fatima Basim. Hundreds of Iraqi soldiers have been killed by al-Qaeda militants who have seized 2 strategic border crossings and several cities in the past 48 hours. This as the Hezbollah brigades in Iraq have joined forces with the Iraqi army to eliminate the ISIL.
Iraqi Prime Minister Noor al-Maliki's security spokesman announced that hundreds of Iraqi soldiers have been killed by the notorious Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant militants in a major offensive that has overrun vast tracts of the country.
In the past 10 days, the ISIL has committed grave and heinous massacres through mass executions of hundreds of Iraqi soldiers and innocent civilians for sectarian causes. These crimes took place in the provinces of Nainawa, Salahuddin, Kirkuk and Diyala.
After its initial swift raid into Iraq's north, which saw them control the city of Mosul, the ISIL has continued to rack up surprising gains in their offensive. Late on Sunday, they have taken control of a strategic border crossing between Iraq and Jordan after the army pulled out of the area following a clash with militants. The move came after the militants overran posts further north along Iraq's border with Syria. The al-Qaeda offshoot has also seized 4 towns in the Anbar province. The militants captured the town of Qa'im on Saturday, and on Sunday the towns of Rawa, Ana as well as Rutba fell under ISIL control. Meanwhile, as the Islamist fighters seek to build an Islamic emirate, the Hezbollah brigades are back to fend off the latest invasion. The resistance group has been tasked with protecting the holy Shiite shrines in the city of Samarra, which have witnessed a number of raids over the past few weeks. For their part, the Iraqi army is making gains in the city of Baquba, just north of the capital Baghdad. The army has said that the operation to retake the capital of Diyala province is near its conclusion, where tens of militants were reportedly killed. Meanwhile, conflicting reports emerged that the northern city of Tel Afar has become the latest town to fall under the extremists' control, though army sources have refuted the claims. The al-Qaeda offshoot has called for an Islamic emirate in Mosul, while they have already controlled Fallujah since January. Now they have taken over 2 strategic border crossings with Syria and Jordan over the weekend. The fall of several towns and key border crossings extended 2 weeks of swift territorial gains for ISIL, pushing them closer to realize their dream of an Islamic emirate.
Well, motivated by the need to keep their country united, thousands of volunteers are continuing to join the Iraqi army in the war against the ISIL.
They are from all walks of life, Shia, Sunni, Kurds and Turkmen. But here, they are all Iraqis. Thousands of men lined up one by one, leaving everything behind. They have decided to fight with the Iraqi army against the ISIL. As the extremist militant group continues to seize more towns across Iraq, killing whoever gets in their way, these men are hoping they will turn the tide of the ISIL's advances.
I swear by God, I came to support our brothers in the Iraqi army to fight terrorism because the ISIL members defamed our women and we can't let them defile our land.
We have received a large number of volunteers, not only young men but also old people and also women. We divided them into groups and we offered them food and drinks. And we brought them into the recruitment centers for the medical checkups, and we have also taken their personal information and entered them in our database to issue them orders.
The pace of recruitment has increased dramatically following calls by Iraqi Shia cleric Grand Ayatollah Sayyid Ali al-Sistani last week to support the Iraq army in operations against the ISIL.
I came to defend my country in response to the call of Marja'iyya and Sayyid Ali al-Sistani to fight against terrorism that came from outside the country and not against our brothers, the Sunnis, Turkmens, the Kurds.
The degree of support has been in many ways a testimony to the frustration of ordinary Iraqis who have endured over a decade of terrorist attacks and who do not desire to see their country ripped apart.
Let's now speak to our Iraq correspondent, Wissam al-Bayati. Wissam, if you could please give us more about the Iraqi army's counteroffensive in western and northern Iraq.
Yes, in fact, the Iraqi army is right now leading too many military operations and conducting too many operations across the country, and it has actually opened and facing more than a front across the country, especially in the northern region and the newly opened front in the south region of the country in the province of Hilla. The Iraqi army today is, according to the description of the top security leaders, is facing the cruelest violence across the country, especially against the Iraqi security forces. The recruitment centers have been witnessing actually a high turnout by the volunteers who wanted to join the Iraqi security forces to support the Iraqi army in counter-terrorism battle across Iraq, especially in the northern three provinces, which are Mosul, Tikrit, and Kirkuk. The deployment of the Iraqi army has been witnessing a kind of change as the movement of the Iraqi divisions have been actually witnessed a kind of activity in the last 2 days, as more than 3 divisions has been sent as reinforcements for the northern region of the country, and at the same time the Iraqi army, represented by the top security officers who have been actually present in the south region of the city of Hilla to counter terrorism, the instability and militancy in these provinces. According to the description of the top security officials and the lawmakers who have stated that the target and the goal of the ISIL militants who wanted to divide the country, in fact, their militancy has united the Iraqis, especially under the banner of the call of Marja'iyya, as they have actually united Sunni, Shia, Turkmen, Kurds. They have all actually responded to the call of Marja'iyya in facing the terrorism and supporting the Iraqi government and its security forces in fighting the terrorism and militancy across the country. Yes.
All right, thank you for giving us those updates. Wissam Bayati, our Iraq correspondent. Meanwhile, the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry held a press conference at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad following talks with Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki and other leaders from across the political and communal spectrum. In his remarks, Kerry vowed Washington's intense and sustained support for Iraqi security forces in their fight against militant groups. He also added that it's a critical moment for Iraq's future, urging the country's leaders to come together and stand united against the militants. Kerry also said that no country, including the US, has the right to pick Iraq's leaders.
The support will be intense, sustained, And if Iraq's leaders take the necessary steps to bring the country together, it will be effective. It will allow Iraqi security forces to confront ISIL more effectively and in a way that respects Iraq's sovereignty while also respecting America's and the region's vital interests. The key today was to get from each of the government leaders a clarity with respect to the road forward in terms of government formation. And indeed, Prime Minister Maliki firmly, on multiple occasions, because it was a great part of the conversation, affirmed his commitment to July 1st as the date when the representatives will convene and when they must choose a speaker and then a president and then the prime minister. And he committed to try to move that process as expeditiously as possible.
In an interview with CBS's Face the Nation aired on Sunday, US President Barack Obama admitted that the extremist group, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, poses a threat to the United States.
How urgent of a threat to the American people is ISIS?
I think it's fair to say that their extreme ideology poses a medium and long-term threat. There are a lot of groups out there that probably have more advanced immediate plans directed against the United States that we have to be on constant guard for. The thing about an organization like this is that typically when they control territory, because they're so violent, because they're so extreme, over time the local populations reject them. We've seen that time and time again.
All right, to discuss this issue further, let's speak to Yoram Abdullah Waila. He is a columnist at the Tehran Times. Mr. Waila, are the Americans essentially calling for Prime Minister Maliki not to take a third term in office?
The Americans, of course, are the ones that got Iraq into this mess in the first place. And I think probably that would be a good assumption on your part that the Americans desire someone else in his place. I have to admit that I'm over here in Denver, Colorado, somewhat in shell shock over this, not so much the ISIL, but the rhetoric that I'm hearing, not only from Washington, D.C., but also from local people here in the Iraqi community in Denver, Colorado, that are saying things that I find absolutely astounding, such as a quote I heard yesterday from one who will remain nameless, that those people over there just can't get along. This is a native Iraqi that emigrated to this country because of the U.S.-induced violence. What you're seeing now, underlying all of this, is lies coming out of Washington. We heard a lot about drone surveillance not being successful. This may or not be true, but it's irrelevant. Why? Because there are up to 8 satellites crisscrossing Iraq and Iran. There are 4 keyhole satellites, there's 4 lacrosse satellites with very precise imagery ability and resolution, updating ability up to every hour. So Washington knew full well what was going on. The question is, what's going on? Why?
Yes, and as you said there, the Washington has realized, and it said it on TV as you just heard there, President Obama said that ISIL poses a threat to the US. Why are they so reluctant to help Iraq then?
What you're hearing is rhetoric. You will note in Obama's speeches that go back to his West Point speech earlier this month that Obama has never referred to what this organization, Dawlat al-Islamiyya fil Iraq wa Sham, he has never referred to that as the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. You'll note that. He has always referred to it as ISIL, Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. Why? Because the United States is providing arms and weapons to the organization, the same organization with the same leaders in Syria. How do we know this? There's been one report at least showing captured tanks and Humvees and other munitions from the so-called siege of Mosul, which regrettably and painfully we saw so many people killed and others up to 500,000 people displaced. These U.S. armaments are being funneled to Syria to fight against President Bashar al-Assad. Why? Because the U.S. Congress would not allow this direct funding to go into Syria to overthrow Assad. This is what's going on, I'm afraid.
So essentially what you're saying is the US is benefiting from what's actually going on in Iraq at the moment. They want ISIL to expand.
Yes, there is benefit to this. Of course, the overall objective in conjunction with the Zionist regime is to have a fragmented, disoriented Middle East because that's easier to control. This has been the objective as far back as at least in the case of Iraq, the no-fly zone. If the United States was so concerned about the Iraqi people, why breaking it up into the no-fly zone? Why the sanctions for 12 years? Why the invasion? All of these things point to nothing but lies out of Washington. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit emotional about this because frankly, this whole nonsense about the invasion of Iraq and democracy and whatever the reason originally, which was probably oil, as Alan Greenspan admitted back in 2007, that the United States invaded Iraq. I am absolutely distraught to see this ongoing carnage. The Iraqi people are suffering, and I wish I knew some way to stop it.
All right, thank you for sharing your thoughts on this. Yoram Abdullah Waila, a columnist at the Tehran Times.
Thank you for having me.
The European Union warned of a looming humanitarian crisis in Iraq as a result of the deteriorating security crisis. EU foreign ministers said the fighting spearheaded by the radical Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant had led to the massive displacement of civilians across the country. The offensive by the ISIL deep into northern Iraq has created a refugee crisis, with many opting to escape the fighting to Iraq's Kurdish region.
The fighting in Iraq has created another humanitarian catastrophe, with thousands of people fleeing the war zones in the north of the country. More than 500,000 Iraqis have fled their homes in the past week, as fighters from the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant advance across much of northern Iraq. Iraq's Kurdistan region is reported to have received at least 20,000 refugees, attracted by the region's relatively stable security conditions. But escaping the violence is the easy part for many families. These hastily erected refugee camps are not able to provide many refugees with even the most basic of needs under the extreme heat of the Iraqi summer.
The situation is very bad. There's no gas for cooking, no electricity, and I'm worried about the safety of my daughters.
For those who were fortunate enough to find houses in the Kurdish region, the horrors they encountered on their journey continue to haunt them.
The journey was enormously tiring. We witnessed bombing and shelling around us. No cars were available. We had to walk all the way down here without water and food. We suffered a lot, spending nights in the streets and later in the desert. It was so difficult for my pregnant wife and for my mother. We had to take several breaks to sit and then walk again. Now when I think about the journey, it was a horror.
I miss my old friends, my beautiful neighborhood, my door, my garden. I used to go out with my friends to the forest, but now I can't even get in touch with anyone. I don't know what happened with them. It's a great tragedy.
The tragic conflict has caused much anguish to many Iraqis, who for now have found shelter away from the violence. But many of them still hope for a quick end to the fighting so they can return to their homes.
Israeli occupation forces targeted 9 Syrian military positions in the Golan Heights one day after an Israeli was killed by a missile launched from Syrian territory. The Syrian Foreign Ministry, for its part, condemned the airstrikes as a blatant violation of the country's territorial sovereignty.
On one side of the border, the Syrian flag flutters high, marking the country's territory. On the occupied side of the Golan Heights, Israeli tanks patrol along the barbed wires, always at the ready. Israeli warplanes have targeted 9 Syrian army positions in the unoccupied side of the Golan Heights overnight, including military headquarters and launching positions. The Israeli attacks come one day after a missile was launched from the Syrian side of the border, killed 1 Israeli and injured 2 others. The Syrian Foreign Ministry, for its part, condemned the airstrikes, saying they are a blatant violation of the Arab state's territorial integrity. Airstrikes periodically target Syrian territory, with the latest being the second in 3 months, that is, of the ones the regime in Tel Aviv actually admitted carrying out. There were no immediate reports of Syrian casualties. The Israeli War Minister Moshe Yaalon held the Damascus government responsible for, quote, what happens from their territory, and warned that the Zionist forces will respond to any provocation by terrorist groups or the Syrian army. Last year, Israeli occupation forces launched air raids on a Syrian research center in Jamaraya, which almost ignited a regional war. Yet, amid a bloody struggle against the armed opposition, which is now mainly comprised of extremist militant groups, the Syrian government decided that a warning was sufficient to quell the Israelis from perpetrating such attacks again. Fighting between the Syrian army and opposition militants on the Syrian side of the Golan Heights have also triggered alarm in the Israeli entity, even though in many cases it received injured militants for treatment. The Golan Heights terrain has been occupied by Israeli forces since the 1967 Six-Day War. Now, as the two sides remain in a state of war, any act of aggression could unearth buried hostility, which has awaited an exhumation that may lead to military confrontations.
EU foreign ministers agreed to step up sanctions against the Damascus government. The first round of sanctions will target 12 government ministers. The decision means EU sanctions, including travel bans and asset freezes, now targets 191 Syrians. In May, Brussels extended existing sanctions against Syria for another year, including an oil embargo and asset freezes against allies of President Bashar al-Assad. Meanwhile, the world's chemical weapons watchdog announced the last of Syria's chemical weapons have been shipped from the war-torn country and are en route for destruction at sea.
The Commission can state that Syria's chemical weapons material has been removed 100% as we speak. This is quite a critical benchmark that has been reached, also with a view to the 30th of June deadline.
Well, staying with that conflict in Syria, and Human Rights Watch has condemned a report condemning the use of children by militant groups, such as the ISIL, warning their foreign backers could be implicated in war crimes.
These Syrian children are off to summer camp, but it's no school-based trip where these kids are headed. They are off to train with the extremist group the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. While kids their age are taught science or mathematics, these kids are taught to kill.
We are the cubs of the Islamic Caliph and the Levant. This is a message to the leaders of Islamic Jihad and the whole Islamic nation, to tell that we will spend our lives in jihad. We will never give up our weapons till we obtain victory or death.
Meanwhile, at another school, a group of children repeat what they are told. The teachers here are no ordinary elementary educators. Their mission is to place more kids out on the battlefield.
ايش اسمك؟ أبو شيماء. أبو شيماء كم لك في المدرسة؟ أكثر من شهر. أمنيتي عندما أكبر أصبح مجاهد أقاتل الطواغيت والذين يحكمون بغير ما أنزل الله.
Recruiting children has become more popular among extremist groups in Syria as more and more armed youth head to the battle zone. Human Rights Watch released a report on Monday urging Syrian rebel groups to stop enlisting children in their ranks, while warning their foreign backers that they could be implicated in war crimes. The report said the militants are using children as young as 15 to fight in battles, adding that some militant groups recruit teenagers under the guise of offering education. The human rights organization interviewed 25 child soldiers fighting for the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, the so-called Free Syrian Army, the Islamic Front, Al-Nusra Front, and Kurdish forces. The children said they participated in battles, manned checkpoints, spied, worked as snipers, and carried supplies to the front line. Many of the children said they joined the militant groups to follow their family and friends, while others said they were recruited after attending anti-government protests. The exact number of the children fighting alongside militant groups in Syria cannot be verified. According to a foreign-backed opposition organization, the Violations Documentation Center, 194 non-civilian children have been killed in the conflict since September 2011. Now, with the Syrian government gaining more ground on the conflict, fears are mounting that more children's soldiers will be enlisted to carry out militant attacks across the country.
Let's now speak to Farah Abdessatir. She is a human rights activist. Farah, is there a reason why ISIL is recruiting child soldiers as opposed to experienced fighters?
Well, this was somehow an expected step, noting not only the ISIL a path during the Syria crisis. However, due to the fact that in most crises or conflicts, international conflicts or regional conflicts, violence soar, targeting the most vulnerable population, women and children. This was expected. This happened already in Chad, which is one of the most flagrant examples when speaking about child soldiers. It had also happened with the Israeli occupation, and we've seen a lot of photos of extremist Israeli and settlers teaching their kids how to use weapons. So if we're about to
and we do know that the ISIL has established scores in areas under its control in Syria. Is the use of child soldiers more than just manipulating children to do bad things? Isn't it about raising the next generation?
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. In fact, this is what's very interesting. They take kids out of the normal schooling system, or they recruit kids who are unfortunately unable to go to school due to war, and then they create their own schooling system with, of course, their own curriculum, preparing for the system that they want to organize and they want to put in place according to their own beliefs. So yes, this is a way to prepare a generation, to brainwash a generation. And you know, it's much easier to start from zero than to bring someone who's already, you know, an adult and to change his mind.
Yes, all right. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on this. Human rights activist Farah Abdessatir. National reconciliation initiatives have succeeded in bringing an end to deadly disputes in several parts of Syria. These efforts come in tandem with consistent advances by the Syrian army, which left militants with no options but to lay down their arms. Our Damascus correspondent Rasha Mevhem has the details.
The Damascus government is stepping up its reconciliation efforts in parallel with a large-scale military operations against militant strongholds in different parts of Syria. Militant groups have suffered extensive setbacks in recent months as a result of the ongoing Syrian army advance and the crippling blockade enforced against the insurgent-held areas.
When we talk about national reconciliations that take place in a certain area, it is clear that they would not have been met without the field achievements of the Syrian army, if those who hold up weapons had not reached a conviction that the continuation of insurgency means one of these two options, either their inevitable death or going for reconciliations, they would not have carried out an agreement. Thus, there is a sort of integration between these national reconciliations and field achievements of the army.
Meanwhile, the national reconciliation committees, along with regional dignitaries, have been successful in reaching a wide range of reconciliation agreements, ensuring that the voice of reason triumphs in Syria. Many regional experts assert that such agreements, which are part of a comprehensive nationalistic project, will bring about an end to the crisis.
To reach an agreement, we should depend on assessing factors, on reliable people, such as dignitaries and national reconciliation committees in a certain area. The more communications are transparent and clear between reconciliation committees as a third party and those who are still carrying weapons, the more the results become positive and prompt. When we talk about a reconciliation, we are talking about a logic of reason, and the only way for the Syrians to find a way out of the open war is through going ahead in fighting terrorism and activating reconciliations.
The warring sides in the Syrian conflict appear to have arrived at the same conclusion, that a military victory alone cannot bring this war to an end. For now, it appears that the only way to turn the page on this bloody chapter in Syria's history is national reconciliation. Rasha Milham, AEE TV channel, Damascus.
You're watching AEE TV World News, still to come. Another ceasefire takes hold between the Yemeni government and Houthi rebels. But will this one hold? We'll have more on that after the break. Welcome back to AEE TV World News. Here's a reminder of our top stories. The Iraqi army says that hundreds of its soldiers were slaughtered by advancing ISIL militants in Mosul as the fight for north and western Iraq rages on. The US Secretary of State makes a surprise visit to Baghdad amid the deteriorating security situation in Iraq. And Human Rights Watch reveals the use of child soldiers by ISIL militants in Syria, a practice which may constitute war crimes. A ceasefire has been announced in eastern Ukraine, with warring parties in the country along with representatives from Russia and the European Union welcoming peace talks and encouraging a solution to the months-long crisis.
The leader of the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic in eastern Ukraine has agreed to a ceasefire in the region until 10 a.m. local time on Friday.
The duration of the ceasefire is the same as announced previously, before 10 a.m. on June 27th. During this period, monitoring by Russian and OSCE representatives will be organized. We hope that during the ceasefire from both sides we will be able to reach an agreement and start consultations on the process of peaceful settlement of this conflict.
The Interfax news agency reported the talks aimed at ending the bloodshed in eastern Ukraine have begun, bringing together a former Ukrainian president, the Russian ambassador, and pro-Russian rebel leaders, along with European officials. Meanwhile, the Kremlin says President Vladimir Putin has spoken over the phone with President Barack Obama, with Putin underlining that in order to normalize the situation in eastern Ukraine, it's necessary to effectively end fighting and start direct talks between the conflicting parties. For its part, the European Union also called on all sides in Ukraine to respect the ceasefire.
I'd invited Ukrainian Foreign Minister Pavlo Klimkin to come and to talk to us about President Poroshenko's peace plan, as well as the plans to stabilise the country. All EU ministers supported the plan as a major opportunity for de-escalation of the situation and called on all sides to honour a ceasefire and create the conditions needed to implement this plan. We called in particular, of course, on Russia to support the plan and use its influence to ensure its implementation.
But while world leaders called for a ceasefire in Ukraine, on the ground, some 600 new volunteer recruits of the Donbas Battalion joined the ranks of the pro-Kiev militia, vowing to fight against pro-Russian separatists in the east of the country.
Ukraine will only calm down when the last terrorist is jailed or leaves Ukrainian territory, be it alive or dead. That's why it's not that important to identify who's firing guns and how many times. What's important is that until today, there is still no full control over certain cities in the territory of Ukraine.
Judging by these volunteers, resentment between Ukraine's rival groups looks unlikely to be resolved overnight, and as long as the two continue to refer to each other as terrorists, a peace agreement seems to be a long way off.
Well, Washington is continuing to threaten Moscow with additional costs if Russia does not take concrete action to de-escalate the situation.
The president spoke to President Putin and once again urged him to support peace instead of allowing the provision of arms and materiel across the border and continuing support for militants and separatists who are further destabilizing the situation in Ukraine. Though we believe a diplomatic solution is still possible, Russia will face additional costs if we do not see concrete actions to de-escalate the situation.
Israeli occupation forces have stormed towns in the occupied West Bank for a 10th straight night, raiding houses and detaining dozens of Palestinians. The latest aggression comes as the Israeli army prepares to end its crackdown without finding any trace of the 3 missing Zionist settlers.
For 10 days, Israeli occupation forces have been raiding homes and businesses in the occupied West Bank in an apparent large-scale search for 3 Israelis who disappeared under suspicious circumstances earlier this month. But if there was anything that this crackdown has produced so far, it was more casualties and detainments. Overnight, the widespread raid was stepped up. This time, Israeli troops stormed areas in Al-Khalil and Jenin cities. Around 18 locations, including local houses and 7 Hamas charities, were searched, while 37 Palestinians were detained, taking the number of those seized from their homes to over 360. Meanwhile, the aggressive campaign was condemned from inside the Israeli entity itself. A host of Israeli organizations have written to War Minister Moshe Yaalon to denounce what they agreed was a form of collective punishment and a human rights violation administered by the Israeli forces. The Israeli military, for its part, announced that the massive campaign will end soon. Surprisingly, it is expected to declare it a mission successful, which experts say confirms the theory that searching for 3 settlers has been used as a pretext to oppress, kill and detain as many Palestinians as possible.
Well, the UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon has voiced concern over the Israeli entity's increased aggression, resulting in mass arrests of Palestinians. The Israelis claim to be searching for 3 missing Zionist settlers. In a telephone conversation with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on Saturday, Moon also expressed concern over the restrictions on the movement of the Palestinians in the West Bank. Over 300 Palestinians, including Hamas members and lawmakers, have been detained in recent days in the Israeli operation. Yemen's warring sides have signed a ceasefire deal to end fighting between government forces and Houthi rebels that have claimed the lives of more than 200 people, namely in the northern west of Amran province.
Since the breakdown last week of a previous truce, government forces and allied tribesmen have struggled to hold the Houthi rebel advance on villages just 40 kilometers northwest of the capital Sana'a, which has forced the government to negotiate. A presidential mediation committee hammered out a ceasefire agreement to stop raging confrontations between the Yemeni army and the Shia Houthi movement in the northern Amran province. The official Yemeni news agency said the ceasefire was signed upon the desire of parties to the conflict and under the sponsorship from the president. The two sides agreed to hold the clashes earlier in June, but this proved to be very short-lived as they returned to lock horns yet again only a few days later. Policemen clashed with armed followers of the Houthi movement in a standoff outside the group's political bureau in Sana'a on Saturday. The ceasefire envisions reshuffling military and civilian leaders in areas affected by the fighting, compensating slain Houthi supporters, and an investigation into the violence. Amran has been the scene of sporadic clashes in recent weeks between the army and Houthi rebels. However, the military encounter between the Yemeni army and Houthis can sometimes seep out of the borders of Amran and into administrative areas within the capital Sana'a. The fighting in northern Yemen has further unsettled the country, struggling to overcome many problems, including a secessionist movement in its rest of south and the nationwide spread of Al-Qaeda militants. Houthis have been battling government forces to end years of marginalization, demanding autonomy and less U.S. interference in Yemen's affairs.
Well, World Refugee Day came as another reminder of the hardship faced by refugees in Yemen. The country's devastated economy and deteriorating security only puts more strain on the lives of refugees entering the Arab world's most impoverished nation. Our Sana'a correspondent has that story.
With the world marking International Refugee Day, in Yemen, events like this are a reminder that the refugee situation in the country is deteriorating.
Yemen itself shares the responsibility for hosting the third largest refugee population in the world, the Somali. Here in Yemen there are 230,000 Somali refugees. They are part of a total population of 1.1 million Somali refugees in the world.
However, Dr. Ahmed Al-Olafi believes the number of refugees are much higher than the official records, a matter which is making it difficult for authorities to properly address the plight of refugees and its impact on the Arab world's most impoverished country.
Current statistics of the UN Commissioner for Refugee just only talk about the official registered refugees, while on the ground I'm sure that there are over 1 million refugees.
Current conflicts in the Arab region has added more strain on the humanitarian work of the UN organization and the host Yemeni country, which itself is suffering from internal conflicts and displacement.
Our country's doors are always open to refugees, but from the international decision makers, we need active international organizations to support Yemen economically in order to cope with the growing influx of poor refugees who need everything from residence to clothes.
This Somali refugee who works at a car wash in the capital, Sana'a, is struggling to make ends meet. He is calling for refugees' identification card to be issued.
When I travel around Yemen to Aden, Mukalla and Hudaydah to visit my relatives, I face several challenges because I don't have legal refugee identification card. We do not need money from the international organization. We need IDs to put us away from problems.
المشكلة هكذا.
Even though Yemen is not considered as the most ideal destination for most refugees coming from Africa, who most often then hope to reach oil-rich Arab countries, most of their attempts are failed for several reasons, and refugees find themselves forced to stay here and share the dwindling resources and try to cope with the dire economic situation.
With stories of refugees' life-threatening journeys full of exploitation by human traffickers and coming face to face with imminent death in the hope for a better life, political experts say if wealth is evenly distributed and justice is served in these war-torn and poverty-ravaged countries, there would be no reason for refugees to even embark on these dangerous voyages. Muhammad Al-Attab, AEE TV, Sana'a.
Peace talks between South Sudanese rebels and the government were adjourned on Monday, with no progress made on forming an interim government or implementing a ceasefire agreement.
Negotiations between South Sudanese rebels and the government were adjourned on Monday, without hopes being dashed that an agreement would be reached to end the months-long crisis. Both sides have boycotted the talks since a meeting earlier this month between South Sudan's President Salva Kiir and rebel leader Riek Machar, who had previously agreed to form a transitional government and implement a ceasefire by August the 10th. According to the government's chief negotiator Maiku Makui, the talks have been adjourned until further notice, without any progress being made. The government had temporarily pulled out after Mahbub Malim, head of the East African bloc IGAD, that is brokering the talks, said both sides were, quote, foolish if they thought they could resolve the conflict militarily. The rebels have continued their boycott, arguing that civil society organizations, religious groups, and other political parties should not be part of the negotiations. A rebel spokesman also said neither side wanted to continue to work with IGAD. For his part, rebel spokesman Hussein Mar said, "We want to have direct talks with the government, and the government is also willing, so it's unfortunate that the mediators have not understood this."
Be under no illusions.
He said the deadline set by negotiators is now unlikely to be met, with talks paused indefinitely, and said the situation is likely to worsen in South Sudan with talks stalled. IGAD meanwhile urged both parties to, quote, assume their responsibilities and return to talks to resolve the tragic situation. The 6-month-old conflict in South Sudan has already killed thousands and displaced 1.3 million people, with aid agencies warning that a massive famine is looming.
An Egyptian court has handed down jail terms varying from 7 to 10 years for 3 Al Jazeera journalists, among other media personnel. 11 out of 20 defendants were tried in absentia, as 16 of them were accused of belonging to the Muslim Brotherhood, which has been designated a terrorist organization. The 4 foreigners, meanwhile, were allegedly collaborating with the others by providing media material. Egyptian authorities also claimed that the convicted journalists were operating without valid accreditation. A senior member of Afghanistan's Independent Election Commission, who was previously accused of fraud, has handed in his resignation. Although the election official denied the charges, he said that he was stepping down to save the election process. The leading presidential candidate, Abdullah, who had boycotted the vote count over fraud allegations, has since expressed willingness to negotiate with the Election Commission.
At around 14:55, Sergeant Lim harmed himself in his side with a rifle and was sent to a hospital. We immediately collected the K2 rifle and bullets carried by him.
Here's a reminder of our top stories. The Iraqi army says that hundreds of its soldiers were slaughtered by advancing ISIL militants in Mosul as the fight for northern and western Iraq rages on. The US Secretary of State makes a surprise visit to Baghdad amid the deteriorating security situation in Iraq. And Human Rights Watch reveals the use of child soldiers by ISIL militants in Syria, a practice which may constitute war crimes. Well, that's all from me and the Al Jizah News team. Thank you for watching and good night.